Influential impact of Toni Morrison's works on American literature. Toni Morrison, one of the most celebrated authors in the world, was born into a Southern black family that had moved north to Ohio during the Great Migration. She was born into a family that exhibited intense love of and appreciation for black culture. Storytellings, songs, and folk tales were a deeply formative part of her childhood. She pursued her graduation from Harvard University in English, following it up with a master's from Cornell University. She worked as a teacher and an editor before being able to support herself as a writer. Her writings portrayed a wide spectrum of Black American life and American culture broadly and received many major awards, including the Nobel Prize for Literature and Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, which she won for her novel Beloved. One of Morrison's greatest contributions to literature was the kaleidoscopic vision with which she saw Black people and the rigorous compassion with which she wrote Black characters. Some of the observations and experiences from her youth made their way into her early novels. However, Morrison's works were not generally autobiographical. She had a passion for portraying the Black American experience in her writing. Morrison placed herself in the lineage of writers like the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, whose Things Fall Apart has become a foundational text in the African literature. She also resisted the view that distinctly American categories of race ought to constrain her storytelling. Morrison's works explored themes of the Black American experience and sought to represent the complexity of Black American life. This meant crafting characters and plots that celebrated Black culture and traditions, yet also did not shy away from difficult or morally flawed characters. Over the course of her career, she also portrayed white characters and white communities as similarly complex, revealing the complicated nature of human relationships. Her writings has often been said to mirror many of the rhythms of storytelling and to make strategic use of lyrical and poetic language within larger fictional structures. Morrison's intuitive understanding of the country's political climate helped her to craft a body of work that addresses the violent injustices committed against Black identity in America, emphasizing a cultural awareness and celebration of the ethnic diversity. Her stunning debut novel, The Bluest Eye, published in 1970, tells the story of Pecola Breedlove, an impoverished young African American girl raised in the physical, sexual, and emotional abuse of her parents' turbulent household in Ohio. Set during America's Great Depression, Pecola's character is centered on her frustration of not meeting the criteria defined by white aesthetic ideals of physical attractiveness. Pecola obsessively measures her distance from the white standards, ultimately reinforcing her own self perceived ugliness. The tragic tale of Pecola explores notions of gender identity in the context of crafting a self within a marginalized racial minority. Her story illustrates the aggressive and devastating effects of rejection as an African American, as a female, and as a member of the supposed lower class. And these characteristics become staples of Morrison's canon and are notably revisited in her Pulitzer Prize winning Beloved. Beloved scrutinizes the horrific effects of slavery on the identity of Afro Americans, and the novel presents Sithe, the protagonist's personal and narrative history fused with the historical context of slavery in the American South in a brilliant culture and political commentary. Through her works, she voiced out the struggles and perils of Black lives in America. Her works represented everything she stood for: determination, resilience, perseverance, and most importantly, freedom. Morrison's novels reshaped the literary landscape of the 1980s America. Her works combined unabashed melodrama with meticulous observations of quotidian life. They freed a particular type of American voice that had run aground. Through her works, Morrison paved the way for and encouraged countless writers who might otherwise have felt there was no place for people like them in the pantheon of American literature. Thank you.
Socio-political situation during the setting of Beloved. And this is presenting by Arundhati AR of 1st MA English. Chloe Anthony Wofford Morrison, who is also known as Toni Morrison, was an American novelist. Her first novel, The Bluest Eye, was published in 1970. The critically acclaimed Song of Solomon, which was published in the year 1977, brought her national attention and won the National Book Critics Circle Award. In 1988, Morrison won the Pulitzer Prize for Beloved, published in the year 1987, and she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. Beloved is a novel by American novelist Toni Morrison, which is set in the period after the American Civil War. And this novel tells the story of a dysfunctional family of formerly enslaved people whose Cincinnati home is haunted by a malevolent spirit. The narrative of Beloved derives from the life of Margaret Garner, an enslaved person in the slave state of Kentucky who escaped and fled to the free state of Ohio in 1856. The novel Beloved by Toni Morrison is set during the Reconstruction era in 1873, and this novel centers on the powers of memory and history. And for the former enslaved people in the novel, the past is a burden that they desperately and willfully try to forget. Yet, for Sita, who is the protagonist of the novel, memories of slavery are inescapable. 18 years earlier, Sita had murdered this daughter in order to save her from a life of slavery. Morrison borrowed the event from the real story of Margaret Garner, who, like Sita, escaped from slavery in Kentucky and murdered her child Wayne slave, Cachus, caught up with her in Ohio. Beloved, in fact, straddles the imaginary line between history and fiction. Considering the backdrops of the setting discussed in the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison, we could analyze the same novel as a womanist neo-slave narrative. Toni Morrison, because of the silences in the slave narratives, due to authorial compromises to white audiences and to self-masking from a painful past, sees her role as a writer as bearing witness to. And this she quoted through the words, the interior life of people who didn't write their history and to filling in the blanks that the slave narrative left. Toni Morrison privileges the authority and epistemology of Black and Third World women in America by saying that I use the phrase bear witness to explain what my work is for. Beloved can also be set as a narrative in the backdrops of American Civil War. It was published in 1987 by Toni Morrison, which is considered as a typical representation of some abstract incidents from the Civil War. In this regard, it will be highlighted that the context is more in the novel rather than understanding it takes place. However, the current time of the novel is unfolding the time of the post-war time period when the major and most defining element in the book has been occurring as the slavery is still existing. In the pre-war-time years of the United States, there was a division on the basis of the issues like slavery. However, the United States had outlawed the institution. The southern states have been completely dependent on the slave labor for any purpose like producing tobacco as well as cotton and other kind of cash crops. The wide resemblance and in-depth discussion and revolutions of the American civil rights movement, along with the problematizing of American and African American history, has been uncovered in Vexations in the relationship between Black identity as well as the American history. This novel is a real account called Margaret Garner, who has been slave in 1856 and while trying to escape under Kiev with her family, killed the daughter and intended to kill all other three children along with herself rather than allowing them to be captured and being returned to slavery. Thank you.
Greetings to everyone, this is Anuriti A from 1MA English. In this video, I am going to talk about Toni Morrison's famous novel Beloved. Beloved, novel by Toni Morrison, published in 1987 and the winner of the 1988 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. The work examines the destructive legacy of slavery as it chronicles the life of a black woman named Seth from her pre-Civil War days as a slave in Kentucky to her time in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1873. Although Seth lives there as a free woman, she is held prisoner by the memories of the trauma of her life as a slave. The novel is based on the true story of a black slave woman, Margaret Garner, who in 1856 escaped from a Kentucky plantation with her husband Robert and their children. They sought refuge in Ohio, but their owner and law officer soon caught up with the family. Before their recapture, Margaret killed her younger daughter to prevent her return to slavery. In the novel, Seth is also a passionately devoted mother who flees with her children from an abusive owner known as schoolteacher. They are caught, and in act of supreme love and sacrifice, she too tries to kill her children to keep them from slavery. Only her 2-year-old daughter dies, and the schoolteacher, believing that Seth is crazy and decides not to take her back. Seth later has "Beloved" inscribed on her daughter's tombstone, although she had intended for it to read "Dearly Beloved." She did not have the energy to pay for 2 words. Each word cost her 10 minutes of sex with her engraver. These events are revealed in flashbacks as the novel opens in 1873 with Seth and her teenage daughter Denver living in Ohio, where their house at 124 Bluestone Road is haunted by the angry ghost of the child Seth killed. The hauntings are alleviated by the arrival of Paul D., a man so ravaged by his slave past that he keeps his feeling in the tobacco bin of his heart. A brief period of relative calm ends with the appearance of a young woman who says that her name is Beloved. She knows things that suggest she is the reincarnation of Seth's lost daughter. Seth is obsessed with assuaging her guilt and tries to placate the increasingly demanding and manipulative Beloved. At one point, Beloved seduces Paul D. After learning that Seth killed her daughter, he leaves. The situation at 124 Bluestone worsens as Seth loses her jobs and becomes completely fixated on Beloved, who is soon revealed to be pregnant. While the lonely and largely housebound Denver initially befriends Beloved, she begins to grow concerned. She finally dares to venture outside in order to ask the community for help, and she is given food and a job. As the local women attempt to stage an escortism, Denver's employer arrives to take her to work, and Seth mistakes him for schoolteacher and tries to attack him with an ice pick. The other women restrain her, and during the commotion, Beloved disappears. Paul D. later returns to the grieving Seth, promising to care for her, and Denver continues to thrive in the outside world. Now, let's focus on the themes of the novel Beloved, the trauma and the memory of slavery. Following the abolishment of slavery, the trauma of enslavement still follows Seth and Paul D, as their relationship forces them both to remember the horrors of their past. This trauma persists in various hauntings, from the Hain possessing House 124 to the sudden appearance of Beloved. Each haunting reminds the formerly enslaved characters of the residual trauma they grapple with even long after slavery's abolishment. Both Seth and Paul struggle with their coping mechanism at the start of the novel, moving between repression and silence. One of the important themes of this novel is the intimacy of mother-daughter relationships. While there are different forms of intimate relationships throughout the novel, the most prominent ones are between mothers and daughters. For Seth, the trauma of motherhood begins with her own mother, who killed every one of her children but Seth. While Seeth cannot comprehend the meaning behind her mother's action when she is younger, she will go on to repeat her mother's violent actions against her own children to prevent them from being captured into slavery. In both incidents, the mother permits the survival of one daughter who will live to either break the cycle of intergenerational trauma or sustain the pain for another generation. For Seed, the tension is exemplified through her two daughters, Denver and Beloved. Whereas Denver stands for the future of growth and healing from trauma, Beloved represents the inability to let go of the past. Denver grows from protecting Beloved to shielding her mother from her dead sister's possession. Despite being afraid of mother's capacity for violence, Denver also realizes from witnessing Beloved's possession that Seed's violence is an act of protection. Denver witnesses her mother's pain over time and understands Beloved's possession for what it is. Meanwhile, Beloved's possession represents an unwillingness to heal. Seeth nurses this possession by providing motherly love in excess, spoiling Beloved, and feeding her own guilt over killing her child. Realizing this is not sustainable, Denver seeks outside help, disrupting the abusive pattern of the mother and the daughter relationships by being open to new forms of kinship that might heal them.
Greetings everyone. I'm going to give a brief biography of Ralph Ellison. Ralph Waldo Ellison was born on March 1st, 1914 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to Lewis Alfred Ellison, a construction foreman who died when Ellison was only 3 years old, and the former Ida Millsap, a church stewardess who used to bring him books she borrowed from the houses she cleaned. Ellison attended Frederick Douglass School in Oklahoma City, receiving lessons in symphonic composition. He began playing the trumpet at age 8 and at age 18 attended Tuskegee Institute in Montgomery, Alabama, studying music from 1933 to 1936. During that time, he worked at a variety of jobs, including janitor, shoeshine boy, jazz musician, and freelance photographer. He also became a game hunter to keep himself alive, a skill he says he learned from reading Hemingway. Completing only 3 years majoring in music at Tuskegee, Ellison sometimes referred to himself as a college dropout. Ironically, Ellison went on to receive 12 honorary doctorate degrees from such prestigious universities as Tuskegee Institute, Rutgers University, the University of Michigan, and Harvard University. Moving to New York in 1936, Ellison met writers Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, which led to his first attempts at fiction and prompted his move to Harlem, where he lived for more than 40 years with his wife Fanny McConnell. Renowned novelist, short story writer, and critic, Ellison taught at several colleges and universities and lectured extensively at such prestigious institutions as Yale University, the Library of Congress, and the U.S. Military Academy. In 1970, Ellison became Albert Schweitzer Professor of the Humanities at New York University, where he served until 1980. He also received the prestigious Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts des Lettres, one of the highest honors France can bestow on a foreign writer. In 1982, he was named Professor Emeritus at NYU, teaching for several years while continuing to write. Ellison died of cancer on April 16, 1994, at his home in New York City. His career highlight: soon after his move to New York in 1936, his book reviews, short stories, and articles began to appear in numerous magazines and anthologies, and Ellison was on his way to becoming an acclaimed author. His early success with Invisible Man. In the early 1940s, Ellison started out writing a novel about a captured American pilot in a Nazi prisoner of war camp. But during the summer of 1945, visiting friends in Vermont while on sick leave from the Merchant Marine, the opening lines of Invisible Man came to him, prompting him to write an entirely different novel. Ellison described Invisible Man, published in 1952, as a novel about innocence and human error, a struggle through illusion to reality. Ellison claimed that his novel comprised a series of reversals, providing a portrait of the artist as Rabel Rouser. Responding to questions concerning the narrator's journey as a reflection of the black struggle for justice and equality, Ellison contended that he is not concerned with justice but with art, pointing out that there is no dichotomy between art and protest. To illustrate, he cited works such as Cervantes' Don Quixote and Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, arguing that these literary works not only embody protest against social and political constraints, but ultimately protest against the limitations of human life itself. Ellison became known primarily for Invisible Man, which won the Rusworm Award and the National Book Award and established him as one of the most important American authors of the 20th century. But he also published several non-fiction works and short stories. His other major works: in 1960, Ellison published his first Hickam stories, and Hickam Arrives, On the Roof, at the Steeple, and the People. In these stories, he introduced Senator Adam Bliss, Sunrider, a light-skinned black man passing for white most of his adult life, and Reverend Daddy Hickam, the Negro preacher who takes him in and raises him as his own son. Ellison also published two important volumes of non-fiction, Shadow and Act in 1964 and Going to the Territory in 1986. These two works, together with numerous unpublished speeches and writings, were published in 1995 and as the collected essays of Ralph Ellison. He also wrote numerous short stories, including King of the Bingo Game, That I Had the Wings, and Flying Home, published posthumously in 1996 as Flying Home and Other Stories. The Hickam characters later appeared in his posthumously published novel, Juneteenth, because the 368 pages of his Hickam manuscript were destroyed in a fire at his summer home in Massachusetts in 1967. Ellison spent the remaining years of his life constructing it. The novel, still incomplete at his death, was eventually published as Juneteenth. From poetry to novels. In a 1954 interview, Ellison contended that by devoting himself to the novel, he took on one of the responsibilities inherited by those who practice the craft in the US, that of describing for all that fragment of the huge diverse American experience which I know best and which offers me the possibility of contributing not only to the growth of the literature but to the shaping of the culture as I should like it to be. Despite criticism from younger blacks who argued that he did not present a true picture of the plight of black Americans, Ellison remained firm on his stance, insisting that the struggles of blacks, although different in some respects from the struggles of whites, were basically the same struggles all Americans had to face in order to achieve a sense of personal freedom and responsibility. Adopting his namesake philosophy, like his namesake, poet and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1883, Ellison believed in the philosophy of transcendentalism, asserting that individuals create their own reality and that reality is essentially mental or spiritual in nature. This accounts for much of his fascination with masks and disguises and his preoccupation with appearance versus reality. Ellison admired the American transcendentalists, particularly Emerson, Whitman, and Thoreau. He liked their faith in the American democratic ideal, concern for cultural pluralism, belief in personal freedom, and idealistic vision of a world in which individuals would transcend or rise above their petty desires for self-aggrandizement, obtain a kind of spiritual enlightenment, and work together for the good of all people. Thank you.
This is Ye Anisha from First MA English. I'm going to discuss about The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison's analysis in this video presentation. Ralph Ellison was born on March 1st, 1913. He was an American writer, literary critic, and scholar, best known for his novel Invisible Man, which won the National Book Award in 1953. He also wrote Shadow and Act in 1964, a collection of political, social, and critical essays, and Going to the Territory in 1986. The New York Times dubbed him among the gods of America's literary Parnassus. Invisible Man begins in the hidden underground apartment of the narrator, who is a southern black man. He explains that he feels invisible because he is black and says other people refuse to see him. While listening to jazz, he describes his home and ponders his childhood. He begins to tell his story and starts with his grandfather's death and an invitation to give his high school valedictorian speech in front of several local white leaders. Before giving the speech, he engages in a boxing match. He is given a briefcase and a scholarship to a black state college. At college, he meets Mr. Norton, one of the college's white trustees, and act as his chauffeur. Mr. Norton feels faint and wants a drink, so the narrator takes him to a brothel called the Golden Day. While there, the narrator unintentionally exposes Mr. Norton to a rowdy bunch of dangerous, mentally unstable men. After Mr. Norton tells Dr. Bledsoe, the college president, about the incident at the Golden Day, Dr. Bledsoe becomes angry with the narrator. As punishment, Dr. Bledsoe sends the narrator to New York City with letters of recommendation, telling him that he has to work that summer to earn tuition for the upcoming school year. The narrator takes a bus to New York and looks forward to living in Harlem. He has difficulty finding a job and eventually discovers that Dr. Bledsoe's letter of recommendation are meant to sabotage his job search. The narrator gets a job at Liberty Paints as an assistant in the boiler room. The narrator is tricked into causing an explosion and is taken to the hospital. He is treated for his injuries. He captures the attention of Brother Jack, the leader of an organization called the Brotherhood. He hires the narrator to be the speaker, gives him a new name, and orders him to move out of Mary's house. Analysis. Invisible Man addresses society's lack of vision toward black people. The narrator's feeling of invisibility due to his race is indicative of the narrow vision of the people who refuse to see him. He lives underground and keeps to himself, which contributes to his anonymity and struggle for self-identity. When he was courageous and idealistic enough to believe the best of people and his future, his experiences with the college president and the Brotherhood discouraged the narrator from believing he could make a difference. The plot of Invisible Man details the unnamed narrator's moral and psychological development. The novel follows this development from the time the narrator graduates high school through his difficult first few years of real-world experience. Other objects pertain directly to the narrator's confused identity. For instance, he carries the fragment of paper where Brother Jack wrote down his Brotherhood name. He also carries the Reinhardt disguise, which enables him to pretend he's someone he's not. Collectively, these objects represent the burdens of historical and imposed identities. At the end of the novel, the narrator destroys these objects or otherwise casts them away in order to discover who really is. The prologue of Invisible Man introduces the major themes that define the rest of the novel. The metaphors of invisibility and blindness allow for an examination of the effects of racism on the victim and perpetrator. Because the narrator is black, whites refuse to see him as an actual, three-dimensional person. Hence, he portrays himself as invisible and describes them as blind. The narrator's central struggle involves the conflict between how others perceive him and how he perceives himself. The narrator notes that, given this situation, it does not matter how he thinks of himself because anyone, even the anonymous blond man on the street, can force him to confront or assume an alien identity simply by uttering a racial insult. Thus confined, the narrator flees the outside world in search of the freedom to define himself without the constraints that racism imposes. Ellison provides subtle reinforcement for the novel's central tension between white racism against black people and the black struggle for individuality. This novel, Invisible Man, works to protest against racism and the cloak of invisibility that is placed on black people. It addresses the oppressions faced by people of color that goes against mainstream white society. Thank you.